The Path to Authenticity is brought to you by GIA Miami. Founded by world-class mental health experts, GIA provides advanced care for difficult-to-treat conditions, including anxiety, medication-resistant depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Using state-of-the-art methods, GIA can help people recover from conditions when more traditional approaches can't. Dr. Antonello Bonci has assembled an expert team serving international clientele in a modern and resplendent Miami setting. If you or someone you love is suffering from depression, anxiety, OCD, or other mental health concerns, call GIA at 833-713-0828. You can learn more about GIA by clicking the link in the show notes or by visiting giamiami.com.
Thank you for listening to The Path to Authenticity. My name's Tom Gentry. I think of this show as the opposite of small talk. You'll hear real conversations with real people who know who they are. We talk about what makes them who they are, how they became who they are, and how we might become truer expressions of who we are. If this is your first time here, thanks for checking it out. If not, thanks for coming back. I'm Tom Gentry, and this is The Path to Authenticity. Episode 173 for May 3rd, 2022. The podcast turned 3 on May 1st. I thought I'd take a little time and just do a little rewind and talk about some of what I covered with this show in 2021-22 since last May. And a lot has happened in my life. My path has definitely changed and gone in directions that I didn't expect. So, started off the year back in the beginning of May, end of April, beginning of May, with a pair of episodes with a podcaster and photographer named Alicia Crossley. Those were episodes 120 and 121. And I also was a guest on Alicia's podcast. And then for episode 122, I did the one that will always be closest to my heart and has been listened to more than any other episode I've done. And that was the episode with my mom that I released for Mother's Day. And in May of last year, this time last year, I knew my mom was nearing death. She was 92. She was about to turn 92 at that time. She did over the summer. But I didn't expect to lose her as quickly as we did. And I'm just extraordinarily grateful that I had that conversation with her and documented it and left it for posterity and as something to give to the people I love. And I was really surprised at the response I got from my friends and, the people who listen to the podcast who were just seemed to really like hearing that conversation with my mom. So I re-released that when my mom died, the day we lost her, which was November 28th. And I'm going to re-release it next weekend. I think every Mother's Day, I'm going to re-release that episode. So, yeah, that was the highlight of all highlights. It's safe to say. And the next episode I did was with an author named Karen Casey, who I had the opportunity to meet many years ago. And I actually bought one of her books and had her sign it for my mom. And she wrote this beautiful inscription that just kind of blew me and my mom away, and was just something very special. To be able to go back and remind Karen of that and read to her what she wrote to my mom, which was basically, having met your son, it's apparent to me what a great mother you are. So that was a treat. That was a treat not only to talk to her, but for my mom to hear me talk to her. Then I did a pair of episodes with my friend, the artist Safa Kagan, who also, during the COVID shutdown, created her escape vortex. Has a yurt on a mountainside in Topanga Canyon where she lives, which has become just taken on a life of its own for her. And we promoted this. She sponsored the podcast for a number of episodes to promote her escape vortex, which I was very appreciative of. And I love the fact that this podcast has given me an excuse to approach people and talk to people, befriend people. And I've just made so many meaningful connections in these past 3 years, and in this past year deepened some of the connections that I made in the first couple. Then, I did after that a few episodes with people who I met on Clubhouse. Dimple Thakrar, who's an author and a coach. Mark Sefton, who's also an author and a coach. And then Sasha Lipskaia, who's an intuitive coach and a healer who lives in Montreal. And not only was Sasha on this podcast, I was on her podcast, and we recorded it right around the same time. But she just edited and finished editing and released the episode a couple days ago. I listened to about the first 10 minutes of it so far. And one of the things I talked about was living in Florida and how I was raised in Indiana, but I was never really an Indiana person. Felt like I didn't really belong there. And, it's just one of the many examples in the past couple decades where I've sort of expressed my belief that I'd never come back. And I really didn't envision it. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that I moved back to my hometown in March and decided to do that after we lost my mom. And I've actually moved into the home where my mom lived for the past 16 years. That's where I'm living. And so, yeah, things change. And one of the things I've learned in life is to be able to laugh at myself and not take myself too seriously. We never know. We never know what twists and turns our lives are going to take. And I'm happy to be here. I'm grateful to be here. I feel good here. I think the person I was before didn't belong in Indiana, or maybe anywhere. But the person I am now does. That's what I think I've learned through this experience. You know, a few weeks after airing the episode with Sasha, I had a great episode with my friend and colleague Lee McCormick, who is someone I sought out as sort of a spiritual mentor and someone I respect and have great affection for. And it was such a good episode, great conversation, and just very emblematic of what this podcast is and why I do it. So I guess that was episode 133. So going back 40 episodes now. The Yogi Ali Pause was next. Rachel Listarte, therapist and author. And then I had the pleasure of doing an episode with my friend Eric Bricker. And this is a big highlight for me in year 3 of the show. After having hosted and produced this podcast all this time, Eric asked me to help him launch a podcast. And so we did that. He has his own podcast now called Good Counsel, and I produce it. I may or may not always do that. I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to be a podcast producer, I guess. Kind of wish I didn't have to produce this one, to be honest. My least favorite part of this is the sound editing. I love doing the talking. One of my goals here is to get to the point where I can just do this part and I can be able to afford to pay someone else to do the heavy lifting in terms of the production and, you know, the back end stuff that really takes a lot of time and isn't what I really enjoy. There are people who do, and, you know, I'm not one of them. But I have gotten much better at it. And if you've listened from the beginning, you know the sound of the podcast, which I've always had compliments on, has continuously improved. Little by little. Better microphones, better equipment to record with. And, you know, I've just learned some tricks. So, you know, I guess I interview a lot of therapists. I interview a lot of therapists and authors. I interviewed Dr. Stevie Pena. That came out after the episode I did with Eric, where we talked about the podcast we were beginning to work on. And then I did an episode that I called Help Getting Help, which was episode 138. I did that with a client who I've worked with who spoke anonymously without giving his name. He was the father of a person who suffered with an opiate addiction, and I helped the guy's mom and dad get him into treatment. And you know, they hired me as a consultant to work through the process with them. That guy's been sober 2 years now. But I had this dad come on the podcast to talk about what we did together, what that process was like. And, you know, I loved that episode too. And again, just being able to document that and be able to always go back to that. And hopefully someone out there will hear it and begin to understand that addiction is a family illness. And the point of calling it what I did, help getting help. A lot of times families need help getting help. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to get help. And I've spent a lot of time doing that over the years. Had a great episode with my buddy Carl Hewlin from the UK. And then one of the real highlights of the year for me this past year is I celebrated 25 years of sobriety on September 7th, which was a Tuesday. So episode 140 was me telling my story. Called it The Great Fact. And I'll leave links to all these episodes in the show notes if you want to check them out. Then the next episode after that was with Amani Sharif, who's an estate agent over in London and just an incredible woman. Beautiful, smart, spirited, just incredible. And I can't say enough great things about her. I hope I get to meet her in person someday. That would be incredible. And then one of the things I decided to do this year was kind of dip into the archives and re-release some of the episodes that I did in the first couple years, especially in the first 6 to 9 months, because having gotten past 100 episodes now, only the most recent 100 episodes are listed in most podcast platforms. So some pretty good stuff got buried. Most notably, episode 1 and episode 5, the 2 initial episodes I did with Dr. Lucia Capacchione on the inner child. So I re-released those. And then in October, I did an episode with Preeta Ji, author, philosopher Preeta Ji. We called that Living in a Beautiful State. She has an enormous following worldwide, teaches spirituality, meditation, her philosophy, has an ashram in India, and got to talk to her thanks to my friend and guest of the show, Gina Moffa, who's a therapist in Manhattan, who happened to know one of Preeta Ji's followers who reached out to her and said, hey, if we were going to have Preeta Ji be on a podcast while we're in the United States, what podcast do you think we should be on? And very kindly, Gina said, The Path to Authenticity, and connected us. And they sent me a copy of Preeta Ji's book, The Four Sacred Secrets. And it was just, there was a lot of heart in the conversation. I just felt so good talking to her. And that is an episode I just shared a couple days ago with a guest who I'll be interviewing soon as one of my favorites. So that's episode 145, Pre to G. I went back and released the episode that I did with the artist Brian Phillips, who was one of the first guys I talked to who I had never met before. And that episode, which was, I want to say episode 10, was fantastic. And it kind of reinforced for me that this idea is good. This vision I have for this podcast, it's going to work. And so I re-released that back at the end of October of last year. Then a couple more therapists from Boca Raton, and then a big one was with Yulia Rose, who is a sex coach, a sexual embodiment coach, student and teacher of Tantra. And that was quite an interesting episode. And then another of what will probably always be one of my favorite episodes is an episode I did with David Sauvage. We called it The Value of Sensitivity. He's an empath and talks about empathy a lot and has written a book, and just a beautiful human being. And just to have the opportunity to talk to him meant a whole lot to me. And he's another guy who I encountered on Clubhouse, and the rooms that he has done on Clubhouse have, consistently, to me, felt like the very best of any that I listened to, took part in. And so I was really, really happy to talk to him, and that was a cool conversation. And, coming into the new year, approaching it, I came up with this idea of trying to engage you guys a little bit by doing this January journaling challenge. So I came up with a journaling prompt for each day in January of 2022, and sent it out to an email list, and also posted it in a private Facebook group. So if people wanted to journal there and share it, they could. And a lot of people did it. And it was really cool. So one thing I'll say about that is my hope was it would be the first annual January journaling challenge, which I'm definitely going to do it again. But I've also decided I'm going to do it in July. So we did it at the beginning of the first half of the year, and now we're going to do it in the beginning of the second half of the year. And that'll be cool. Then I had a couple poets who I did episodes with some time ago, and again, buried episodes that I wanted to reshare. And, I have more listeners now than I had in the first 20, 50 episodes. So I'm really proud of the stuff I did in the beginning, and I wanted to share it again. I wanted the people who are listening now to hear, some of these first interviews I did. My friend Spencer Reese, who's a very accomplished poet, that was one of them. And then the last episode of the year 2021 that I did was one like this, where it was just me talking, called Invoking the Muse. And I also read from the manuscript that I've been working on, which, speaking of that, one of the things I talked about in that episode is that my goal was to have it done by now, by the beginning of May. And I realized, one of this move that I made to Indiana has been slightly humbling because I just haven't been able to do everything I've wanted to do. Haven't been able to reach all the goals that I've had. I've been here a month and a half. I haven't painted the place yet. There's a lot I haven't done. The studio where I'm recording, the sound isn't the way I want it yet. I have some work to do on that. I got a little overambitious by releasing. I'll get to this. I have some new podcasts that I've talked to you about, and hopefully you've heard by now. But that's something else that happened in year 3. But, I launched all those right as I was moving. And, obviously I wouldn't have planned that. I just kind of, absentmindedly did it. And, I took on too much. I bit off more than I could chew. And, so I realized, a couple months after I released this episode in which I read from the manuscript, and that's the December 27th, 2021 episode, Invoking the Muse, episode 156. I read a lot of my writing for this manuscript, probably 20 minutes of it, and got a great response from you guys with that, and I'm very proud of it. But I needed to reel myself in a little bit, and I realized not long after I released that episode that it's pretty unlikely I was going to be able to finish this manuscript by the beginning of May and move and do everything that it takes to move cross country and start a new job. There was just no way I was going to do it. So I kind of decided maybe the end of the year, the end of 2022, maybe I can have it done. But also, this book that I'm working on, the idea, where I'm going with it, the concepts, it's taken many years to sort of muster. And it hit me the other day, I don't need to set imaginary deadlines for myself, really, to put pressure on myself. I mean, I want to be consistent, I want to be disciplined, and I want to get it done, and I want to have a goal. But also, I've been working on this for a long time, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to, at the 11th hour, force it. And I'm still learning what it is I'm trying to say, what I want to say with this book. And that's part of the reason that I launched this podcast with my friend Ed Tilton this year called Men Who Talk. Because, it would give me an opportunity to sort of talk through some of these concepts that I'm writing about. And that's been great. That's gotten a really good response. And, that is sponsored by the agency where Ed works. And that's been a really cool thing. And, re-released the first episode I did with Ed kind of to promote that. Did another episode with Hannah Euler, who's got such a beautiful voice and presence. She's gorgeous. She's a coach who works with a lot of women. And, we had another great episode. And she's launched a podcast of her own now. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Really cool. That's something that I had talked to her about and had encouraged her to do because she has a lot to say, but also she's got a beautiful voice. Like, I love listening to her talk. So then, I interviewed the guy who hired me to work for this facility in Indianapolis part-time, this job that I took at Circle City Sober Living. His name's Jamie Engel. That's another episode that a lot of folks have listened to. Spoke to Sejal Patel, another Londoner, or Brit. Maybe she doesn't live in London. I'm not sure. But she's also a coach, someone else that I met on Clubhouse in the same room where I met Amani, some incredible women in this room on Clubhouse. And that was a cool episode. It was really a pleasure getting to know her a little better, to learn more about her. I re-released my episode that I did with my great nephew, Taylor Krausor, who's an actor and comedian. And the next episode that I released was with his significant other, the actress Kristen Alderson, who is the most famous person who I've spoken to for the podcast. And literally grew up on soap operas, acting on soap operas, and enormous online following. So that was a hit. That was a really cool episode. And had a conversation with Fawn Clark, who is a nutrition coach in Ireland. And, then just the beginning of April, I released an episode with Dr. Antonello Bonci from GIA Miami, which brings me to a major milestone for me in this past year. And that was finding a sponsor for the podcast who made an annual agreement with me. They committed to advertising for an entire year. And I've been extraordinarily lucky with this podcast, having had an advertiser almost the entire time. And also to have a different agency make an annual commitment and to pay it all up front. And one of the things that I really needed to do was raise my rates, and I raised my rates substantially, and they didn't bat an eye. And this isn't the kind of thing, their sponsorship of the show will raise awareness of their program. There's no doubt. Will they have what most people would consider an adequate return on their investment? I'm not sure. Maybe. I think if they got one client, it probably would be enough. And maybe they will. I don't know. But my point is, the reason they advertised, the reason they made a year commitment is because they believe in what I'm doing. They believe in what I'm doing. And just makes me feel like $1 million to know people of such professionalism, who do such quality work, and who are just wonderful people, believe in me enough to make that kind of commitment and follow through with it. So then the last episode I did before this one, you might know, was with my friend Jenna Malian, who is just wonderful. She's one of the people who I've met on Clubhouse, who's just become a great friend and someone who I really value my interactions with. So, yeah, it's another milestone and a good time to reflect, and it feels good just to talk through this and reflect with you guys what's happened with this show in the last year. And I have re-released a lot of stuff, and I've kind of felt bad about that. I haven't produced as much original content, but they've all been good episodes. And it afforded me some flexibility through this process of losing and mourning my mom, which, you know, this move, packing up and leaving Florida and coming back to Indiana, it's part of it. Like, this is how I've mourned my mom. As I sit in what was her second bedroom, which is now a little makeshift studio I've created. It's been quite a year. Some really great stuff has happened. So I haven't mentioned this yet, but I plan on creating a Spotify playlist to accompany this. So again, I'll put a link in the show notes. Yeah, it's been a great year. And I have some great shows coming up. I've done 2 interviews in the last 24 hours. Last night, I spoke to an author who also teaches writing, sort of a book coach, and also integrates mindfulness practice in that work that he does. Then this morning I spoke to Coach Jilly, who was on the show a while back at the very beginning of COVID, back when we were people were hoarding toilet paper, the great toilet paper shortage of 2020. We had our first conversation in the midst of that and have just had solid interactions since. And she does this thing on Instagram called Sex on Saturdays, and where she takes questions and engages with her audience about sex and our beliefs around it and thoughts around it. And I've shared some of mine with her. And at one point, we kind of agreed that some of what we were talking about would make much more sense to have a long conversation for a podcast episode than it would to, you know, try to do it within the confines of Instagram and all of its limitations in terms of how participants can communicate. So we did that today. Talked about sex for an hour and a half. And really talked about love and relationships and life. It was great. And then this week, I'm very excited to be talking to someone about the Akashic Records. Which, if you don't know anything about that, Google it. So, I'm not going to say much more about that right now, but this, you know, woman who I'm very excited to meet and talk to, she's going to give me a little coaching session relating to the Akashic Records. And we're going to do a deep dive about me. Prior to me interviewing her, she wants me to have a good understanding of the work that she does before we do the interview for her to be on the podcast. So really excited about that. It's something I've kind of learned a little bit about over the last decade, but not a lot. And I'm fascinated by it. It's heavy stuff, but very interesting stuff. And I'm open to it. So that's going to be really cool. And, I got some great folks who I'm working on getting on the show. And, I love doing this. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to me that someone would invest the time to listen to one episode, let alone many episodes, or to be a patron of mine on Patreon to access the supplemental content. It means a lot to me. And if you've listened to this, you've heard me say this before, but, the podcast is the path to authenticity, but the process of creating this and carrying it out has been part of my path to authenticity, to my truest self, to my most authentic self. I've never been happier in my life. And a lot of that is because of this show and you who listen and you who have been on this podcast with me, the deep connections I've made. I mentioned a lot of people who I've had on the show in this episode, but there are lots more. Some of the most wonderful people you could ever meet. It's been a gift. It's been one gift after another. And I love it. And I appreciate it. And I appreciate you. Thank you for listening. Please keep coming back. Stick around. Yeah, I don't know what year 4 is going to look like exactly. I would have never guessed it would be happening in Indiana. But it is. Here I am, and I'm excited about it. I'm going to talk to some people from my hometown. I'm already working on that. Some great people. And I'm going to enjoy myself and continue to enjoy doing this work, this podcast. And this is really about you. It's about you having the life that you want. My goal for this has always been to create content that people can listen to and hopefully either be inspired or encouraged or cheered on, whatever, to be themselves, to heal their relationship with their self, if that's what they need to do. And that's what I'm creating because that's what I needed. And that's what feels right to create. And I have other stuff I'm working on too. Didn't even mention my spinoff podcast, 20 Questions, which I've released a couple episodes of, and I'm working on a sponsorship agreement for. In the weeds, totally in the weeds with sound editing. I have 20 episodes of that to edit, 20 episodes of this little podcast, How It Happened, not 20, maybe 10 of those to edit. And then 6 of the 8 episodes of Men Who Talk to edit. And each of those, basically 30 episodes, represents at least an hour of sound, which takes 3 hours for me to get through, at least generally. So it's a lot. I got a lot to do and I'm behind, and forgive me for that. I've made some commitments in terms of publishing this stuff that I haven't been able to keep. And in the last week, I've had to just give myself a break and realize, I bit off more than I could chew, like I mentioned before. So, but all this stuff is coming, and I think it's really good stuff. I'm proud of it. And I hope you're enjoying all this. And I guess I just will ask, if you don't subscribe or follow the show, please do wherever you listen. That helps. And if you're willing to leave a rating or write a review, that helps a lot. So if you like this, don't be afraid to say so. I'd really appreciate it. I'll take all the support I can get. But I love this, and I love you guys, and I appreciate you sticking around, coming back. And I'm going to say what I've always said in all these episodes. These 3 years. Be nice. Be nice.
That's our story. I hope you enjoyed the punk rock opera. And we have one last piece of music for you. It goes like this.
Okay, go. You cannot make us, we are the Jedi Man! Cheat, you wanna stop, you wanna tear us down. We are the bad plans, man, we got our roots stuck in the ground.
Generation self-made bands, we cut our teeth with bloody hands. The rage has instilled in us, can feed a crowd, give them a rush. Thank you. And good night.